I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Sarah Ladislaw. I run the Energy and National Security Program here at CSIS. There's a lot of new but also familiar faces here this morning. For those of you who are not familiar, CSIS is a nonprofit bipartisan organization that really focuses on trying to bring strategic insights and analysis to the international security landscape. We've been around since the mid-1960s, and we do this in a variety of different ways. I am privileged enough to work in the energy program, which has been around since about 1979. I think some people who used to work in the energy program at one point in time are here in the room. And what we try to do is talk about the ways in which energy is changing from a policy, market, and technology perspective. And I think that's particularly important in the context of what we're trying to do today, which is to have an event that is focused on how we're talking about the U.S. energy landscape right now in the context of the U.S. election cycle. And, you know, U.S. elections are not necessarily just interesting, informative, and somewhat entertaining, especially this one. But they really do afford us an opportunity to look at what's happening in the energy landscape and think ahead about what, no matter who the administration is next time around, some of the things that they're going to have to be spending some time thinking about. And so we're really grateful to all of you for spending the day with us to do just that. Before we get started, I just want to do a couple of housekeeping things. Today's event is on the record, and we expect upwards of 300 people to be here at any course of the day. So please, you know, do watch your belongings and your things, take them with you. We are a very sort of family-friendly atmosphere, but there'll be a lot of people sort of coming and going. Please turn off your phones so that we don't have a lot of interruptions during the day. And when you do sort of ask questions and engage in the conversation, wait for the microphone because there's a lot of people watching online. I also will get professionally dinged by Dr. Hamry, who runs the place, if I don't tell you how to get out of here if we have an accident. We take security very seriously here. So you can either go down the front stairs and out through the front door, or you can exit out one of these doors or to the door to the right of the elevators, go down to the alley, head out front. Hopefully it'll still be a nice day. There won't be thunderstorms. And you can occupy a space out on the front lawn. We don't expect anything like that to happen, but you know, please just in the case of an emergency, take care of yourself. So today, I think what we're going to do, and you all have agendas in front of you, what we have found over the course of several administrations is that candidates have platforms and policy agendas, and then life happens. So when you think about the Bush administration, 3 administration or kind of cycles ago, you had a period in which there was a huge focus on rapid emerging developing economy growth, energy demand growth from China. And really sort of trying to think about energy security policy from the perspective of how we ensure that the United States has enough affordable, reliable energy supply to be able to meet that demand. And over the course of that administration, we had several different events that also shaped that policy agenda, right? So for example, we had the tragic events of 9/11 that put a huge priority on critical infrastructure protection. We also had the blackouts in 2003 that caused a huge focus on reliability in the electric power sector. And we had 2 very large and substantive energy bills come out of Congress, 2005 and 2007, energy policy acts that changed some of the tax incentives and some of the policies, the renewable fuel standard and the like, that were shaping the context of energy policy for that administration and still today. Then in the 2008 election cycle, you had very much the same sort of high price, energy security, future of the U.S. economy focus from a lot of the candidates, but also, really at that time matching the goals of energy security with the future of economic growth in the United States, creating green jobs, and also sort of bringing in the climate change imperative, right? And that administration, currently still the sitting administration, ran into some interesting events during its first term as well. All right, so you had the global financial crisis and economic collapse that changed what was supposed to be sort of a cap-and-trade program-oriented energy policy to something that was much more stimulus effect spending-oriented ways of bringing about sort of more renewables, more green infrastructure, and things like that. By the time they got to re-election and the 2012 election campaign, you also had the Gulf of Mexico oil spill and a nuclear disaster in Fukushima. So you had a lot of different things that have changed over the course of the administrations. And as you look forward, and what we're trying to do today is put together some panels that look forward on a sector-by-sector basis at some of the challenges that any new administration is going to face because of the things that are changing in the U.S. energy landscape. So clearly an oil and gas renaissance in the United States, but one that was realized and is now going through a period of low energy prices, low oil and gas prices, whether they're cyclical or lower for longer, we can have a good discussion about on our first panel. But also sort of, the environment where we've got more aggressive domestic climate policies, where are those going to go? What's happening in the electric power sector with the real and significant cost reductions that we're seeing that are challenging the business case for a lot of folks involved in the electric power sector, in challenging state and local officials to really think about how they're managing their energy markets and managing the way that their electric power sectors are structured. We're going to talk about transportation, something that I think if you're working at the state, regional, or local level, you think a great deal about. But at the federal level, we have sort of have recently had a passage of a transportation bill. But I think anybody who has jumped in an Uber or a Lyft recently or thinks about the status of Metro, I hope anyone who got here today via Metro had a good trip, thinks about sort of these new transportation policies, the future of transportation, understands that that is a field that is very ripe for change, again, no matter what the next administration is. So what we tried to do for you today was bring together people who were of similar ilk to us, who, regardless of who the next administration is, they will be focusing on these issues. They care about them for the long term. And not to have a political conversation, but to have a conversation about what any new administration is going to need to focus on, what is actually going on at the state and local level, what are federal policymakers going to have to grapple with, and how we should be thinking about and preparing for those sorts of things. So we really welcome you here to today's conversation. I would be remiss not to thank Lisa Hyland and Andrew Stanley, who have put together a great deal of not only the logistics, but also the speakers for today. We really appreciate it. I'm going to thank them again at the end of the day as well. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Frank Verrastro, who's the Senior Vice President here, and quite frankly, the creator of this magnificent energy program that I now get to run our first panel on oil and gas, upstream, midstream, and downstream with an excellent panel. So Frank, take it away.
Okay. So along with Sarah, I'd like to welcome you all to CSIS. We're pleased to have this panel, and as she said, as we go through the election cycles, one of the advantages or disadvantages is looking at this from a political perspective every 4 years, but the issues that go beyond the 4-year cycle. And if we actually go back and look at where we were in 2008 or even before that, so the United States is now not only a large energy consumer, but a large producer as well. And we've seen with low energy prices, when you looked at the impact, generally speaking, for a big consuming nation that was import dependent, low prices should be terrific for the economy. Being a big producer and having the benefit of job creation as a result of what the energy sector has done has made it a little more difficult. And then you add the climate piece as well. If you go back to 2007, U.S. oil production was around 5 million barrels a day. In 2015, it was 9.7. In 2007, gas production, shale gas accounted for 6 or 7%. By 2015, it was over 60% of what our production profile looked at. We've drilled tens of thousands of wells, and the stimulative effect, as well as the ability to put us in a position to increase security and self-sufficiency. We're now 90%, over 90% energy self-sufficient, which has changed the energy security dynamic as well. In terms of exports, we're still a net importer and a gross importer of about 7 or 8 million barrels a day, so still consistent, but we now export a lot of petroleum products. Earlier this year, we exported the first LNG from the Gulf Coast, and by 2016 or 17, we'll be a net gas exporter. What does that mean for the world? So the dynamics continue to change. But as we look forward, we want to get beyond just the near-term cycle of either high price, low price, what are the environmental impacts, and look at how we balance these perspectives. Because energy policy, I would argue, in the United States, since at least I've been around, has always been subordinate to foreign policy, economic policy, environmental policy. And the role of policymakers is to look at that trade-off and see where the costs and benefits are. And I can't think of three better people to have that discussion with this morning. When we looked at who we would want to have this discussion and to find the balance, we thought that the impact would be to look at domestic production, the economy and security piece, to look at the environmental piece and what the trade-off is, because climate change is a big, big issue for us all. We're moving to decarbonization, but the pace and timing and scale of doing that means we have to keep the current system robust even as we look for a decarbonization pathway. And to do that means double investment, looking at infrastructure and making sure the timing and the policies are right. And then the third piece is community engagement. When we looked at, I see John Guy's here today, when we did the Petroleum Council study on prudent development, which was the first awakening that we saw, there was a white paper when we actually looked at the hard truths document. So this goes back to 2007. And unconventionals was a really new thing for people at that time. And it basically said that there's a potential out there. If we look at the ability to drill 30,000-foot wells and there's multiple horizons, we could have a lot of natural gas. And by the end of the day, we looked at 18 or 19 big plays and the thought that we could have tens of thousands of trillion cubic feet of natural gas plays. And gas has helped the environment and has met our needs in terms of reducing carbon emissions. But going forward, even gas has some issues, as well as infrastructure. So as we move forward, those are the things we want to focus on today. So we've chosen to come and help us with that discussion Karen Harbert, who's to my far right. Karen is president and CEO of the Chamber of Commerce Institute for 21st Century Energy. She's a former assistant secretary of energy, where her portfolio was both domestic and international policy. And before that, she was a deputy assistant administrator at USAID. Mark Brownstein, to my immediately right, is vice president of climate and energy program at the Environmental Defense Fund, and he leads EDF's oil and gas practice, in particular with focus on unconventionals and methane, and we're going to talk a lot about methane regulation. Prior to joining EDF, Mark was with PSEG. He's also spent time as an air quality regulator for the Department of Environmental Protection in the state of New Jersey. And in the middle, we have Tisha Schuller. Tisha is now a private consultant. She works with both Fortune 500 companies and with NGOs on issues of energy policy, strategy, management, and communication. She's also a strategic advisor for Stanford University's Natural Gas Initiative, and we'll ask you to talk a little bit about that. She comes to her new post after serving as president and CEO of COGA, the Colorado Oil and Gas Association. So for the last several years, she's seen up close and personal the interplay between economics, infrastructure development, and the environment. Prior to that, she served as a vice president for Tetra, which was an environmental consulting and engineering firm. And we're going to ask to talk about the local and community dynamics as well as we start drilling thousands of wells or tens of thousands of wells. So Karen, let me start with you. Have a couple minutes, then we'll open it up to discussion, and then we will save time to have questions from the floor.
Sure. Thanks, Frank, and thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for being here on this lovely day. I just want to make a couple points because I know we want to have a robust discussion. You know, I think it's important to notice in the election that we currently find ourselves in, energy really hasn't been a big part of the discussion. We've had sound bites here and there, but the candidates in some ways have a luxury of not talking about it and not defining their differences because of low prices. It's not a big issue. I guarantee you if it was more like 2005 with $4.50 gas, we would be having a very different discussion. Or if natural gas prices were at $12, $13, it would be a much different discussion. But over time, they're not going to be able to get away with that. They're going to have to define themselves in some way of where they are on energy and on climate, and we'll see things, I think, maybe get a little bit more thoughtful. You know, the other part of this is that the election cycle is very different than the energy cycle. Energy policy doesn't run on 2- and 4-year terms. It doesn't even run on 8-year terms. And if you think back 8 years ago, as you pointed out, the change in our energy landscape from becoming from an era of energy scarcity to now an era of energy abundance, it didn't happen because of some miraculous policy. It happened because of industry innovation, entrepreneurship, the system of laws that we have in this country that allowed it, but not because the government set out to say, we're going to change this, and they had a pathway to do it. And that remarkable innovation is an industry that looks way beyond the election cycle. And that has pros and cons. I mean, the con is that you have to manage uncertainty and try and figure out and look around the corner of what you think might happen and be willing to be wrong. And all of us that have been in the energy business for quite some time, we were dead wrong about where we thought we would be this year, right? And so forecasting is a dangerous business. If the former CSIS guy Caruso was here, he'd have to admit he was dead. We were all dead wrong. And we're going to be dead wrong again, and that's okay. This is an industry that is used to risk and uncertainty, and it manages around it. And there'll be new challenges and new opportunities to manage around going forward. So I'd have to say, when you look at the title of this, is that it hasn't been yet a big part of the 2016 election. It will be part of the next president's agenda, right, for sure. And I think on the transformational versus incremental question, the industry has been transformational and policy has been incremental. Because most of the policies that we have in place today are still based on the assumption of energy scarcity. We haven't had that big modernization of energy policy, which the next president is going to have to tackle. Because we are awash in resources, and that goes way beyond oil and gas and even coal. We do have abundant natural resources in wind and solar and biomass and the potential for, we have amazing opportunities. It's how do we choose to harness them? And I think it's instructive to look at recent history through the recession and what happened. Here we went through a tremendous financial crisis and ultimately a very deep recession. And you looked at the unemployment that was, seeping into all parts of our economy and our country, and the industry that was hiring the most was the oil and gas industry, hiring against the economic trade winds. They saw opportunity and they seized it. And you look at the statistics, oil and gas employment went up by 36% during that time, and non-farm employment went down close to 2.5%. And so those jobs that were created really sustained the economy, embedded themselves into the economy. And this is something I really want you all to walk away with, which is energy used to be an input into our economy, and now it is absolutely embedded in the foundation of our economy. We have lost a good deal of the jobs that were created because the industry has become so much more efficient. But that is so fundamental to the economies, not just of North Dakota and Texas and Oklahoma and Pennsylvania and Ohio, new industry players, but the supply chain that winds so deep throughout the entire economy, has changed the complexion of so many cities and urban centers and rural areas that is now something, if we were to walk away from that, would have huge negative implications in our economy. It certainly would have geopolitical implications, and it would have environmental implications. Even the president himself said, I'd rather have it produced here where we have stringent environmental regulations than produced somewhere else that doesn't. And so we're good stewards of the environment. We're getting better and better every week, producing more with less, protecting the environment, increasing and investing in technologies. And why would we want to forgo that? And that's what the next president has to decide, is how do you harness that opportunity, continue the progress that we're making, accelerate it if you can, but what policies do you need to do that? And right now we don't have it. We've decided we don't want to produce more offshore. We're making it harder to produce onshore. We're looking at a whole suite of regulations that are going to make energy more expensive. And if we do that, the investments that are keeping our economy afloat right now, largely investments coming from Europe and other places, industries that want to have low prices, will go away. So it's now the domino effect. It's not about an energy policy decision. It's about an energy, economic, geopolitical, environmental decision. Much more complex, much more important, and the next president is going to have to tackle them. They can't bite around the edges. And that's really important because it does embed and infuse itself into our entire system now, whereas before it was on the margins and a liability. Now it's an asset with a complex integration into our system.
Thanks, Karen. One of the things that strikes me, it seems like for the last 10 years, markets have driven policy, or policy has been slow, they followed. If you look forward with some of the parameters that we're putting around development, we may be entering into a time where policy drives markets, either in investment decisions, tax incentives, regulatory, the inability to build infrastructure. So that's the point I want to pick back up on. But Mark, we'll turn to you for a perspective.
Sure. Well, lots of people are sitting here today handicapping the federal election and thinking about, who's going to be president and what impact could that have on the future of environmental policy as it relates to energy. And we're seeing some, at least in some of the rhetoric that we see in the presidential campaign, we're seeing what could be some fairly stark choices, and people are beginning to handicap, does that mean we'll see future regulation, or we'll see regulatory rollback, and so on and so forth. And for those people who are playing that game, I would ask you to consider two thoughts. First is that much of the environmental momentum around energy policy, around oil and gas development in the United States today has been coming from the local and state level, right? We have seen some very progressive environmental policies emerge from places like Wyoming and Colorado, okay, Pennsylvania. These are places where, yes, there are some communities that are very concerned with the impact that oil and gas development are having. And there is very much a grassroots movement to curb or stop development. But for the vast majority of communities in these states, it isn't a question of whether we have development or we don't have development. It's whether we have development that at the same time honors the communities where that development is taking place with proper environmental regulation and safeguards. The vast majority of people that I have interacted with at the state and local level are not necessarily anti-development, but they sure are concerned about the air quality in their communities and the water quality in their communities. And what they don't accept is that they have to choose, right, between production and the environmental integrity of the communities in which they live. And so what you're seeing is you're seeing local and state officials respond to that. Right? Wyoming has some of the best leak detection and repair requirements in the country for air pollution and methane emissions. Why? Because local communities in Wyoming are concerned about air pollution that sometimes can be as bad as what you see in Los Angeles. Right? Colorado instituted a comprehensive set of air and methane regulations precisely because of local concerns about air quality and the impact that it's having on communities. So whatever happens at the federal level, I suspect that impetus, right, to have protections in place will remain. The federal government can choose to be a partner in that or not, but it remains. I'd say the other dynamic that we need to think about is the international dynamic. Right? It's axiomatic that although we are producing more energy here in the United States, energy security at the end of the day is about diversity of supply, and that is very much about interdependence of markets. And the United States will continue, even when in this period of abundance, continue to be part of an interdependent international marketplace for energy. That's an economic fact, but I would also submit to you that is a policy fact as well. If you look at what happened in Paris in December, 185 nations, we just had the signing of the agreement last week. Right? There is a certain sensibility that has now emerged in the international community about the pressing need to address issues around climate change. And each country, and what makes the Paris Accord different from anything that's come before it is that each country is now engaged on this issue in ways that are organic to those individual countries' policies and politics. And I would submit to you that it creates a much more sustainable platform to address the issue of climate change in the years ahead. So irrespective of whatever administration comes in, there is a now global expectation that every nation needs to do its part. And the United States is and will continue to be thought of as both an energy and environmental leader, and that expectation of leadership will continue to be there. The significant fact that the Prime Minister of Canada and the President signed a climate accord in March, the centerpiece of which was to address methane emissions from the oil and gas industry, tells you something about the fact that opportunities for global participation in the energy system will come along with environmental expectations. In North America, we continue to see a greater integration of US, Canadian energy infrastructure. We're now seeing it with Mexico. Expectations about environmental performance will come along with that. And so whoever the next president is they'll have to wrestle with that dynamic as well. And we can, Frank, as we go in, we can talk about what I think some of the specific issues are. But maybe I'll leave it there as a frame.
Terrific, good setup. So Tisha's opened the door to federal, state, and primacy. If you could touch on infrastructure a little bit too, because one of the concerns have been is that as individual states do their regulations, the number of producing areas is not 3 or 4 anymore. It's from areas that historically have been producers, but also new areas. I mean, one of the problems that we saw at the beginning in the Bakken was the population density was 10 people per square mile when all this broke out. What you were doing in terms of development in the Bakken versus eastern Pennsylvania, where the population density was 35,000, couldn't be the same. So companies had to adjust to that. But the notion that you still want to be able to deliver energy no matter where it's produced and get it from point A to point B. But your experience in Colga, can you share that with us?
Sure, thank you, Frank, and Sarah, thanks for having me. In my framing remarks, the work that's being done here and the work that you're participating in is so crucial to taking energy from the sidelines, as Frank made in his opening remarks, to really its important and rightful place as the underlying cornerstone of so much of what needs to happen in policy and in the economy. And it's so fundamental. Mark used the term interdependence, which I love because our lives are so extraordinarily interdependent on oil and gas resources that we're completely unconscious that everything we're sitting on, leaning on, texting on, using, how we all were moved here, how the food was moved here, how the water circulated here is all comes to us from some form of fossil fuel, and ultimately oil and gas play a central role in all of that. And how discussion is framed in policy does matter, and it matters how it's framed in politics. Because Karen mentioned the presidential election, and energy is really a sideline topic, but when it has been raised, it's been overwhelmingly negative. And overwhelmingly, it's so fashionable to be anti-oil and gas that it's absurd. It really speaks to how much we take this extraordinary transformation and resource for granted. And so the reason it matters is because when I ran the Colorado Oil and Gas Association, and here I sit unencumbered by being the face of the oil and gas industry, which for many years did have to, by its very nature, inhibit my remarks, but I'm entirely unconstrained now. And what I can say is that in Colorado, we passed 5 national precedent-setting regulations in 5 years. And I was counting them on my fingers to make sure there were actually 5 last night. And EDF was an important partner in 4 of those. And this is an extraordinary legacy if you think about the controversy happening in a state. And 5 national precedent-setting regulations in 5 years, but virtually no transformation of the polarization of the conversation. And so when you have presidential candidates having total license to say things like fracking should be banned, or I'm really uncomfortable with fracking, or things that are just so fundamental and really, truly irresponsible in their nature, it has a trickle-down effect onto the compromises that we can get done. I would say that it's probably a fair characterization to say in Colorado right now, there's not a climate where you could do a national precedent-setting regulation right now. Why? Because the sides are so polarized. It has become completely acceptable to be anti-oil and gas, to be anti-fossil fuels, to support divestment from fossil fuels. Something that underlies every aspect of our economy it's now okay to vilify. And even though I don't represent the oil and gas industry, I'm very comfortable with what it feels like to stand in their shoes. And how motivated are you to engage in meaningful compromise when in the media, in the presidential election, and nearly any forum you go to, your work, fueling, energizing America and the world, can be caricatured so so awkwardly and put you in such a defensive posture. And so what I really wanted to leave you with is what I think is just the absolutely fundamental requirements to engage in meaningful policy solutions. And my perspective comes really more from state level negotiations, and then ultimately we engaged in dozens of local level negotiations, so local regulations or local bans or local compromises, and achieved many, more than 20 successes for the 4 bans or whatnot you might have heard on national use. And so I think a key recipe for success is it's important to identify, when looking at parties in a potential policy negotiation, or even looking at advocates, is the advocate more interested in the fight than in the solution? And right now it's totally acceptable in many cases for advocates to be more interested in perpetuating the fight than perpetuating a solution. But that needs to be a fundamental criteria for progress, is having partners at the table that are more interested in policy. The second is recognizing the trade-offs of energy. So it's become totally acceptable, and I imagine we may even fall into this trap today, to anthropomorphize our energy. So to imagine that coal is somehow evil and like has horns, and windmills are more angelic. And we have a more sophisticated crowd here, but even in very informed policy discussions, we can fall prey to this idea that decarbonization is better than carbonized without understanding that our smallest impact solutions in many cases will come from oil and natural gas. And even though Karen said it's dangerous to forecast, I have absolutely nothing to lose. And I will say, I think the transformative future R&D solutions are going to come out of the oil and gas space, period. And I think it's silly to imagine that we could invest all our resources in R&D elsewhere and imagine this massive infrastructure we have becoming at some point worthless. And so the idea that we have angelic and evil forms of energy is silly, and we really need to think about trade-offs and R&D and the best solution for the best space. And the third component is that we, negotiators at the table, must be willing to give space for our opponents to evolve and to evolve their positions and to come up with solutions. And when we saw transformative regulatory solution, like a national methane, the first nationally effective methane regulation in Colorado, it's because there were room for companies to be part of the success story. And companies made room for environmental organizations to be part of the success story. And I don't see a framework where that can happen at this moment in time. And the final piece is, the fourth and final element, is that we must recognize that success is messy. So this idea that there are solutions and they're not going to have trade-offs and they're going to, that there are, if just we did this, then these wonderful things would happen is silly. The really interesting, really progressive steps forward that we can make are messy. They require trade-offs and they require working with people who aren't, who don't view the world as we do. And ultimately, as we progress, I think this idea of framing conversations and recognizing that it's important. You can't vilify people up here and then expect to actually get stuff done down here. And then working through these steps of bringing the right people around the table and the right framework is really important.
Thanks, Trish. So what we've set up to be, before we came up here, we were actually discussing this role of vilification and polarization, right? And as we look into an election year, when you listen to the candidates talk about energy, it's in the vaguest of terms, unless you're against Keystone and then by association against all natural gas pipe. I'm from New England, and I got to tell you, if we don't move gas into New England, the notion of burning trees or pellets in your stove or oil for heating, oil and gas, and one of the reasons we started with oil and gas today is it not only makes up the largest component, 65% of energy demand, so going to what both Karen and Tisha talked about, is when you woke up this morning and turned on the lights in your bathroom and started your coffee. Electricity is used for a lot of things, but heating, fossil fuels have been used for heating. We had Fatih Birol here, though, February of last year, and then in October. But we were talking about the role of solar, and the IEA had been demonized for not being progressive enough on solar or optimistic enough on solar. And these are one of those little takeaway factoids that solar right now accounts for, with all its growth, 0.6% of global energy demand. 0.6%. So double it, triple it, quadruple it, you still need 90% something else. And if we don't continue to work nuclear, and Charlie Curtis is in the audience, and there's a number of people that have worked nuclear over decades, the notion of backing down a nuclear power plant and a gigawatt of power, you not only have to replace it with a lower carbon alternative, which is tough, right? But that requires a lot more natural gas in the interim. Coal I have a less of a concern for, but there's a social issue on coal, only because if it's in the ground, it's not going to go anywhere. If we decide that there's a way technologically to extract it safe, soundly, cost-effective, meeting environmental standards, then we can always go back to it. It's not moving to Mexico, right? We're not going to lose it. But those people that have worked in that industry for 20 or 30 years or second or third generation, keeping the lights on for all of us and actually spurring economic development as we move to make those companies not viable anymore. In the aftermath, you look at, who pays for the health and social costs of their retirees, right? Or who pays for remediation when the company's there no more? So you need to take a different perspective. Throughout today, you will hear both on the transportation technology side, on the renewable side, what we're going to try to give you is a flavor for the integration and the interdependence of all these fuels and how it fits with societal needs. And then as we go forward, what deep decarbonization looks like and how we get there. But it can't be willy-nilly. But you also can't pick your winners from the start because frequently we're wrong in picking winners, right? What I want to start with this panel, though, is this notion of you open up the door on the demonization, right? So the role that you need, when we look at the oil and gas situation, and Mark, we were talking about this before, so 95 million barrel a day world, about 80 million barrels a day is that as oil, give or take. If it's got a 5% decline rate, that's 4 million barrels a day. When you add on to that new demand growth of, say, 1 million, 1.5 million, so 5 to 6 million barrels a day, over the next 3 years, you're looking at close to 20 million barrels a day of new production that you need just to keep the system in balance. That's 2 Saudi Arabias. What does that look like? And I'm going to turn to Karen to start with, but as we look at the development, phenomenal development on onshore production with the unconventionals, these wells typically produce 800 to 1,300 barrels a day. What we've done in this low price environment is restrict the ability of people to make final decisions on offshore development, which is increasingly expensive, or you can't get the lease terms, or there's areas that have been taken off the table in terms of lease availability. These platforms produce 250 to 350,000 barrels a day. So when you fill the gap or look to fill the gap in the future, it can't just come from onshore unconventional. Because as we've all pointed out, the impacts on the local communities of drilling tens of thousands of wells and hooking it up and dealing with methane and water issues is almost impossible. Karen, can you start and just talk about the offshore and the range of optionality that we need to keep?
Sure, and you point out an excellent issue, which is at the moment, in the low price environment, those companies that have the bank sheets to actually invest offshore are holding off and husbanding their cash a little bit to figure out what the environment might look like. But they're also not managing for tomorrow or 5 years from now. They're looking at 2050 of where they need to be, right? And that sounds like a really long time from now, but it's only 35 years from now.
It's short.
And you look at a world 35 years from now, because that's when a lot of these things are going to be up, at their peak or coming down. What does that world look like? And first of all, we're going to be adding 2 billion people to this planet between now and then, and they're not going to be, denied the opportunity to improve their quality of life. Governments are going to make decisions to improve the quality of life of their citizens. We're looking at that right now in the Middle East. They're spending more of their own molecules in the Middle East, developing new industries, new opportunities, trying to meet the needs of their citizens to keep them off the streets. And you look at the energy demand associated with that, and that's where I won't forecast because 2050 is a long time from now, but it is going to go up by a heck of a lot. It's going to take a lot of money. And those decisions are going to be made within the lifetime of this next president and new leadership in Canada, new leadership in Australia, new leadership in the Gulf, new leadership in Europe. And so all of this is very interdependent. What's going to happen to the North Sea? Are we going to see in Alaska that we're going to forego the opportunity to have the Trans-Alaska Pipeline shut down? I mean, are we going to have the Trans-Alaska Pipeline shut down because of policy decisions that are being made now? that make it uneconomic up there. And so offshore is going to be a hugely important component to meeting this energy demand, not just because of the pushback of some places, but because of the scale. And the scale is normally attributed to those companies that have the bank sheets, have the ability, the environmental wherewithal to produce it, in a manner that is consistent with our environmental aspirations. But I want to go back to one point that you just mentioned, and raise your hand if you're not for clean air or clean water. Everybody is, all right? And so we have allowed this debate to devolve into it's energy or the environment. You're pro the environment or you're Neanderthal, right? Well, I want to see every Neanderthal come to a meeting like this and get here. And we're going to hold it without any water, any lights, we have allowed it to get to the gutter. And we've got to bring it up to a practical discussion of everybody's going to have to be uncomfortable with the solution, to your point, right? We're going to have it all. And those that are against nuclear, well, wind and solar can't make up that with a low carbon future. If you're uncomfortable, we are going to have it all. And, there's the soundbite of, all of the above, but that's really truly the solution. And what we've seen, whether it is in the auspices of what's happening in debate in the UN, where the head of the UN climate program is saying, we need to slow population growth. Well, that's really uncomfortable, right? We've got to be smarter than that as a globe to figure this out. And frankly, can I borrow your cell phone? If you look at 8 years ago, 10 years ago, and you look at the transformation of just the oil and gas industry, forget solar, wind, nuclear, everything else that has transformed itself as well. In 10 years, we went from an importer to an exporter, and we're awash in these resources. This didn't happen in 10 years. But this industry has transformed itself. So I totally agree that the solutions will come from transformations and technology advancement, things that we can't even see. And I think there is more technology development happening in Denver, happening in Houston, than happening in Silicon Valley. And that will transform not just the energy sector, but our economy, and using materials differently in airplanes, in rail cars, all through the entire economy starts there.
And Karen, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I know you're for responsible development, right? I mean, you've got a common sense regulatory guidance to get people
to use a Canadian term, I know there's some friends from Canada in the room, they have a wonderful term, which is a license to operate, right? If you lose that license, that social license, you lose it. It's hard to get it back. Right. And so there has to be responsible development. There has to be safeguards. There is a place for government. But again, government can't come in and over-regulate, because that then decentivizes the industry from innovating and moving beyond even where the government isn't very good at setting ceilings. So we want to go beyond what if we're looking at some of the regulations now, we want to incentivize the industry to become more efficient, more safe, more clean, more environmentally responsible every single day without squashing its ability to operate.
So Mark, you spent a lot of time working with the industry, but obviously in the environmental community, on how do we use this fuel, but use it smarter, safer, cleaner, and more efficiently. Talk about some of that work, and especially the methane regulation.
Well, and let me set the context here. I mean, I think one of the things that we have to sort of, get our minds around is that there is in fact a limit to how much carbon we can put into the atmosphere and have temperatures on the planet that we would consider to be livable. It's accepted globally, right, as that we're aiming for a world where the temperature rise is 2 degrees Celsius, right? That is the consensus. But there are many around the world who believe it should be 1.5 C, in which case we're coming very close to reaching our limit in terms of how much carbon we can put into the atmosphere and stay within that temperature rise. Right. What we're talking about here, therefore, is a need for a fundamental energy transformation. And the only question is how quickly. Some of that is a question of technology. A lot of that is a question about economics. And a lot of it's also a question about equity. If you look at the various analyses that have been done about future oil and gas and coal use, in the context of that reality, that there's only so much carbon that we can put into the atmosphere, right? You see that we are fast running up against the limitations of our current use, of our current use. Frankly, if we do more to limit coal use around the world, we create a little more time for oil and gas development, coal being, twice as carbon intensive as natural gas. But there's a limit to how much even natural gas we can use within these constraints. That's the reality. Okay. Now, we can create some new headroom, right, through innovations around carbon capture and storage. Okay. That's an area where I think the oil and gas industry, and frankly the coal industry, has been underinvesting in innovation. We'd like to see more. Okay. But that by itself isn't going to solve the problem. We are going to see a fundamental transformation. We need to see a fundamental transformation. Now, that does not mean, however, that there aren't things that we can do in the meantime to reduce the impact that oil and gas have on the environment and on the climate for whatever period of time we continue to use the resources. And that's where the methane issue comes in, Frank, because what many people don't realize is that methane is a much more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide itself, upwards of over 80 times more potent as a warming agent than carbon dioxide. And so while carbon dioxide is, what we worry about in terms of long-term warming, it accumulates in the atmosphere and stays there literally for millennia. Methane breaks down very quickly, but for the time that it's in the atmosphere, it is doing more to warm, to accelerate warming than carbon dioxide itself. And so, right, we can have a profound impact on the rate that our planet is warming simply by reducing methane emissions from the oil and gas industry. 25% of the warming that we're experiencing right now on this planet is due to methane emissions globally. We now know that the oil and gas industry is the largest source of methane emissions in the US economy and is about second or third largest globally. And so therein lies a tremendous opportunity, right? By doing a better job of keeping the product in the system where it can be beneficially used, we can have a profound impact on the rate of warming that our planet is experiencing right now. It's a true win-win. Now, as I said, that doesn't dismiss the discussion about what the long-term energy transition needs to look like, the technologies that we need to have, and the cost of that, and over what time frame, right? But we can't lose sight that we have a near-term opportunity here with the industry. And the good news here is that the technologies to achieve these methane reductions are well understood. You go back to the Prudent Development Report, we talked about it there. You talk about there have been analyses now that ICF International has done for the United States, for Canada, Mexico. We have a good handle on what kind of strategies need to be deployed in order to reduce the methane emissions. It's the basis upon which the US and Canada have now made a joint commitment to achieve a 45% reduction in oil and gas methane emissions by 2025. So it's a tremendous opportunity for the industry to make a positive contribution to reducing warming by doing nothing more than being more efficient with how it does its current business. It's a great opportunity.
So just in terms of the cost, first a comment, then a couple of questions. So I know you used the 80%. EPA is using 26% now, and I think that's the standard just because, so the early years it's more potent just because of its chemical composition, but it does decay. So on the back end it becomes CO2, carbon monoxide, and water vapor.
See, but right, but this is so that's, you're right. That's what EPA currently does. That's what the International Convention is. What the science is telling us, though, right, is that to look at these basket of short-term climate forcers simply for their long-term climate impact, right, is to undervalue the role that they play in warming right now, right? We saw in the last several months, right, dramatic examples where we see a shift in climate. First of all, not only the seasonal temperatures that we've seen that have made, January and February and March here in North America the warmest on record and the warmest globally, right, on record, right? But then you've also seen dramatic examples of major parts of the Greenland ice sheet beginning to calve off and rapid glacier melting, right? So that is all pertaining to the rate of warming that we're experiencing on the planet today. So if you want to prevent those extreme, what I'll call tipping points,
You go after the most potent first.
you go after that which affects the rate of warming right now,
Right.
while you continue to work on reducing the pollutant that affects the temperature of the planet over the long term. They're both important, right? It's not as if we do methane and ignore CO2, but for too long we've only done CO2 and we've been ignoring these short-term warmers. And that's the reason to think about methane as a tremendous opportunity, right? You came out of Paris, and the first question that came out of Paris was, this isn't enough to enable us to stay within our 2C world. Where are we going to get more actions than what was put on the table in Paris? And none of these actions are happening soon enough. The answer, right, is to focus on short-term climate forces, and in particular, the issue of methane from the oil and gas industry.
So I'm a biochemist by training, and I would argue that the standardization on the science part is you have to look at front end and back end. I get your point, but I think the 84 is overused. The second point, though, is on the economics of this. And I know that you were instrumental in looking at both capture from platforms and facilities, but also system-wide. So we haven't looked at like the streets of Boston, for example. We've got a lot of old infrastructure. How do we go about bringing that in the system?
Well, we have looked at the streets of Boston, and we know that the local distribution system, particularly in the northeastern United States, which have older equipment,
Right.
have relatively high leak rates. When we talk about dealing with the oil and gas methane emission issue, this is not a fracking issue.
Right.
This is an oil and gas issue. This is not a production issue. This is a systems issue.
Okay.
Okay, so we're not just talking about what's happening at the well pad when we talk about the need to address these emissions. We're talking about gathering and processing. We're talking about transportation and storage, right? We had the Aliso Canyon disaster out in California. Okay, that's a failure of a storage facility. By the way, a storage facility owned by a local distribution utility.
Right.
Okay, and so to get a handle on this issue, it's not one set of actors. It's not just producers, it's not just frackers, okay? It is truly endemic to the oil and gas industry and the oil and gas system. It needs to be looked at that way.
And I know the EDF's position, and a lot of the studies have come out, is that a lot of this it's seals, valves, diagnostic tools. Some of this is easy pickings, simple replacement.
So you're changing out, valves. They're called high bleed pneumatic valves. And, right? Well, what are they? They're valves that basically actuate, open and closed, on the basis of differential in gas pressure, right? The valves are designed to bleed gas in order to be able to open and close. Well, if you change those valves to valves that operate on air pressure, right, or that are electrically operated, you reduce a significant source of methane. So just changing out valves. But what we found is that a significant fraction of emissions from the oil and gas system, right, come from leaks. And these are leaks that, are basically random, for lack of this is not the exact scientific term, I won't say stochastic, okay, but they're random for the most part. And so what's required is a systematic leak detection and repair program in which you regularly go out and survey your system and then fix what you find. And we have the technology. A good example is, we now have infrared cameras that came out of the Department of Defense that are now being used for civilian use
leak detection,
to be able to detect gases that otherwise can't be seen. You walk your system with the camera. We have partnered with 7 companies in industry in what's known as the Methane Detector Challenge, in which we are working now with technology innovators to come up with monitoring technology that acts as a sensor, like a smoke detector, that you could put, at your compressor station, or you could put at your well pad, that would send an alarm when methane emissions began to exceed a preset level. And that's the indication to send your repair person out there, drive out, see what's going on, and fix the problem, right? So, we're in an age where information technology is rapidly evolving to the point where we can greatly lower the cost of leak detection and repair. And it can make a huge difference. And this is both about saving product, but as I said, a huge difference in controlling a pollutant that is a major driver of the warming that we're experiencing right now, and a great way for the industry to be constructively engaged in addressing the issue of climate change, even while we have this longer-term discussion about what is the future of fossil fuels.
What's the transformation? So,
right?
Tish, you were up close and personal to these discussions, and how did that work on the local level, the acceptance of?
Yes, there's no group that's more engaged in making more progress than EDF, and I would imagine that Mark and I have more in common than we have different perspectives, which are probably quite small. But I would offer that I think framing energy policy discussions in the context of climate change is a mistake. So I think setting up the context of talking about energy, starting at the point of a carbon-constrained world and working backwards, is something that alienates 50% of the population, and it probably alienates 80% of energy producers and energy-driven policymakers. So I would offer a different framing, and we talked about this earlier, which is we don't know what energy demand will be, but we know that in the developed world it's flat to decreasing. We know that in the developing world it's going to double. And so if you instead set a framing around energizing the world, 1.4 billion people currently don't have access to meaningful energy. Getting them access to meaningful energy does all the good things that we want to have happen. It increases life expectancy, decreases infant mortality, ultimately decreases birth rates, and ultimately creates an environment where people are more interested in environmental topics. So it creates societies that can differently prioritize the things they care about. And a framing of energy policy, even in the United States, with an eye to energizing the world, raising people out of poverty, being realistic about where the sources of carbon and methane are going to come from in the world, which is, although the United States and what we do here is really important symbolically, on a grand scale of emissions, it's not ultimately going to be the driving factor. These are things that can give us a united view of how to proceed and can bring people to the table in a way that they want to constructively make change. And so when I said in my opening remarks, getting people to the table and letting them have a win, the framing of the conversation is important. If you sit down around a table in Colorado to negotiate a local regulation, if the driver is, we have to get rid of your emissions because you're warming the planet unacceptably, that's a difficult framing. If the framing is, thank you for the energy that's empowering the world and has transformed our economy and has kept us employed during the recession, and then there's an opportunity. You will not find any organization that doesn't share the goals of reducing their emissions. You will find organizations with people that are tired of being vilified in this global conversation. And I think the framing matters in how we ultimately politicize and then work to policy.
Well, let me suggest that, because again, depending on which analysis you want to look at, right? Even if you take the carbon tracker analysis, which is often used by the advocacy community as sort of the gold standard in terms of what kind of limitations will need to ultimately be in place on fossil fuel, right? So the common statistic that's often thrown around is that 80% of current global fossil fuel reserves will have to stay in the ground in order to stay, in that 1.5 to 2C world, right? Okay, right? That's a shocking statistic for those people who are in the oil and gas business, right? But the flip side is that 20% of existing reserves, right, remain in play, even in that carbon-constrained world. And I'm often surprised by the number of oil and gas executives that I talk to that really don't give much thought to, right, what am I sitting on and how do my reserves comport with that 20% that will be remaining, right? From an energy policy standpoint, if I were looking at this, and I were committed to the fossil fuel business, I'd want to make sure that most of my investment is in that 20% that will continue to be developed and used, right, as opposed to the 80% that's going to be phased out over time. That's how I'd be thinking about it. And what's more, I'd be thinking about how to take the cash flows from my existing assets, right, that are throwing off cash right now, and how to redeploy them to enable my business to continue to thrive as an energy provider into the future. But it might mean less offshore platforms, and it might mean other business opportunities. And you're beginning to see this, right? You had the announcement by the CEO of Total just this past week, right? Which talked about basically using the existing fossil fuel assets that he has basically as the cash flow that allows him to begin to think about other things.
But let me push back on the 80% for a minute, because that is a nice soundbite. And embedded in that soundbite is an assumption that 80% can never be viable in a carbon-constrained world. And I would push back on that completely. Because we have already seen the industry reduce methane emissions without a methane regulation, because it was in its own interest to do it. And so you have an industry, and you have an economic and environmental and energy policy today that has said, if we're going to be moving this direction, the only thing that we have is to subsidize the cleaner forces of energy so that they can compete with these, more affordable forms of energy. That's what we have today, is let's subsidize wind and solar, and depending on which country you're in, they expand the definition of what a renewable is. Remarkably, we still don't count nuclear as a carbon-free emission source of energy in this country. So we subsidize those that are more expensive so they can more fairly compete with those that are more affordable. Wouldn't it be remarkable for the 2 billion people we're going to add to this planet, the 1.4 billion people that still don't have access to energy, and the American consumer, if we actually thought about how to lower the price of these renewables, if that's the pursuit, so that they can compete fairly squarely in the marketplace with these other forms of energy. And then what we've done is not narrowed the toolbox, which is what our policy trajectory is you're only going to be able to select these things, is that then you have a toolbox which is very much bigger, and those that are affordable at the beginning that you want to become cleaner are then really incentive to gain market share by becoming more clean. So, that's sort of the American way, is competition. And what we're saying today with our energy policy is, no, we don't like that. We're going to self-select and tell you what can be in your energy policy. There is no more direct example of that than the Clean Power Plan, which said you must switch. And by the way, now natural gas is not really an option, and you're only going to get credit for renewables. That's the government telling you how to do it, rather than saying, you know what, it's going to get really tough out there, so you better get your act together and compete more fiercely by lowering your costs, lowering your emissions, whatever metric you want to choose, so that we have more tools in the toolbox. That's a fundamentally different policy, decision than what we have today.
Okay, so inadvertently, this is where I wanted to get to. So I know we have to open this up for questions, but I want to ask one more question just to bring this out on the panel and tease it out. Where we are in this space is because, so the center right now is not an attractive place to be. We talk about ourselves being the radical middle. We're bipartisan, nonpartisan, and there's a lot of advocates on both sides. But you need to find solutions, so I agree with everything that's been said. Part of the problem here is the absolute, whether it's a 2 degree or 1.5 degree, and how do you get there? When you look at some of the data on methane emissions, where gas production has increased, but emissions have they're down from 1990, they're down from 2005.
Actually,
they're up recently. They're up recently.
They're not down from 1990, and they're not down from 2010.
Oh, the EPA
Well, the EPA is now recharacterizing their data.
They're down, because they've got better data, because we worked with industry to go out into the field and get better data, and they're using that now to recalculate their inventory. That's good news. Okay. Has there been growth in production? Yes.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Okay. The amount of emissions coming from the industry, though, is now 9.8 million metric tons. Okay, on a 20-year basis, that's as much pollution that's more pollution than 200 coal-fired power plants.
But Mark, don't avoid the practical part of this, though, is that at the beginning part of the century, 2000, right? Shale gas was 2% of our supply. Today, it's 30-something percent, 33%. Right, even more, and we're on a trajectory for it to be over 50%. And yet at the same time, the emissions per molecule, if you want to make it that, are coming down. And what we don't want to see is a perverse policy paradigm that doesn't incentivize and reward that.
except, so this is where the absolute comes in. If your target is, right, if the preeminent priority is the climate, and I go back to Tisha's point, I mean, so if you're living in this world and you expect to be around a while, or you're a grandparent and have children and grandchildren, no one wants the world to go down the toilet. So this demonizing one side or the other, but the ability to find the space to work for the solution. So I get the headroom argument. The headroom argument is terrific, right? If you buy yourself more time, you get a technological breakthrough, maybe you get an economic incentive, you find a new source, you do battery storage technology breakthroughs, you look at adaptation. There's a variety of things that you can preserve in a longer time frame. We just don't seem to be in that political space now. So the last question for you before we open it up is, what would be the suggestion to get us where you can have that conversation, look at a decarbonization track, deep decarbonization, right? Because we're doing the easy stuff first, but what does the next steps look like? And should we be going down a different path or not foreclose an option that we may need later?
Well, so a couple of things, right? So first of all, right, you certainly can point to examples of individual companies. So take the methane issue again. I mean, you certainly can point to examples of individual companies that have been innovating in this space, okay? The vast majority of the industry, though, hangs back, right, and waits to see what the regulatory response will be. So we know, as a practical matter, that there needs to be some kind of standards in place in order to create a level playing field so that, frankly, the progressives in industry see some reward for the steps that they took in leadership, as opposed to being economically penalized because they're the only ones that are incurring additional cost. Not that methane reductions are all that costly, right? Less than a penny per 1,000 cubic feet of gas produced. This is not expensive stuff to do. That being said, right, if you're talking about long-term energy transformation, I mean, clearly you want to have policies in place that put a proper price on carbon, right? And that gets to the issue of, not picking winners and losers, but internalizing the cost of this pollutant into capital allocation decisions and operating decisions so that you can begin to rationalize what operates going forward and also what gets built going forward. But I'll tell you something else too. I mean, if you look at it, but it's not just price on carbon, right? You talked about the gas pipelines into New England. Okay, I'm not so convinced that we need new gas capacity in New England. When you look at the quote-unquote gas shortage during the polar vortex of 2014, there were at least 2 pipelines that had excess delivery capacity into New England during that entire event. Mm-hmm. Okay, and the reason is that we had very sticky wholesale market rules on the gas side that weren't harmonized with the more progressive rules that we had on the electric side. So there's a lot that we can do to simply harmonize, our market rules to make use of the infrastructure more efficient.
Yeah, we also have oil heating in New England, which doesn't make a lot of sense.
Let me just make it a point, because I think it's important. We sit here from a position of entitlement, right? I mean, we are very blessed to be able to even have this discussion about methane or whatever, because we have abundant resources here. We have, we are a superpower. We have a robust economy, recession, non-recession, forget it. We sit here from a position of privilege. Think of Africa, as they are going to develop quite robustly over the next 50 years. And what options should they be afforded?
Absolutely. Now, let's think of Africa.
But hold on. But wait. So, I mean, it's not that, of course, it's a very sunny continent. Of course, there are huge opportunities, but there are big mining operations. There are engines of growth. And no economy has grown without abundant energy to fuel that economy and industrialize. There are fewer sources out there that cause that to happen than what we're talking about today. So there is an industrialization question. How do you do that cleanly and ensure that we have a healthy environment? And the United States has a technologically leadership role to play there. But the electrification of Africa is not going to happen just with a few select sources. And we have to be practical about that, because no poor country takes care of its environment. And so to your point, Tisha, I mean, raising the quality of life for people empowers their economy and their country to take better care of their environment as well. So we have to be practical about some of the things that are surrounding us coming from a point of privilege.
And we are very privileged, and we're also privileged to be able to afford measures of adaptation that much of the poor world can't.
Can I?
Okay, because the impact of climate change might, we can build, dikes and levees around New York City and New Orleans, okay? Much harder to think about what impact this issue will have on the people of Bangladesh, right? Who have neither the resources to address the changes nor any place else to go, okay? And so we have to think of this, right? The equity issues are on both sides, right? I happen to think, as a practical matter, that when you think about these long-term analyses that contemplate limitations on fossil fuel use, that 20 or 30% that maybe you're going to be using in the future may very well be for energy systems in the developing world, where more of the advanced energy systems will be in the industrialized world, right? It is more likely, right, that we can afford to do some of the transitions here in the United States and in Western Europe than might be the case in Africa, right? So you do have to look at this not only in terms of total amount of fossil fuel use in the future, but also what's the equitable distribution of that use. And I'm not at all foreclosing the idea that a more significant share of fossil fuel use might actually occur in the developing world, where in the developed world, more advanced technologies will have supplanted that need.
Okay, I'm going to get Tisha.
I would offer a middle path here, which is when I went to work for the...
seated you appropriately.
Yeah, through the Colorado Oil and Gas Association. I left my comfortable environmental consulting job because I was I wanted so badly to prioritize climate change. And I thought if I went and worked in the oil and gas industry, I could help, deliver the good word. And so 5.5 years into beating my head against that wall, I ultimately came up with the understanding that to prioritize addressing climate change, we need to rally around a goal that is more inclusive. And it might be that most people sitting in this room are comfortable making that the framework for discussing worldwide energy policy, but that is not the case in a large number of strategic discussions happening around the country. And I would offer instead that if you can rally people around a vision of empowering the world, of raising people out of poverty, of understanding that that's where energy demand is going to come from, then you have partners who are, of course, interested in the clean components of that energy. It really does go without saying that if you bring a company into a community, they want to do right by that community. It's just that once they get into an adversarial position, the options become extraordinarily limited. And to this question that always comes up of whether we, sitting here in Washington, D.C., or Aspen, Colorado, or wherever we might be sitting, whether we should prioritize climate change because other people they will not have the resources to adapt. We know if you pose that question, if you've traveled anywhere in this world and you pose that question to a developing country, they want access to energy. They want access to economic development. They do not want other people somewhere else thinking about how we're going to prevent what they have to adapt to. And if you are sitting in a mud hut somewhere with minimal infrastructure, the prioritization is economic development. It's not this abstract climate change and future adaptation. And I think we could accomplish a lot more in the space of climate change by creating a more inclusive framing of the topic.
Thanks. You've all been extraordinarily patient, so let me open to questions for the floor, and we'll still be able to get you out on time. We have 3 simple rules here. Wait for a microphone, identify yourself and your organization, and if you can, pose your question in the form of a question. And I know commentary is coming, but we try to at least limit that so we can use the panel. So please, questions. Okay, Laura, we'll take you to the back.
Hi, thank you for your comments. Laura Brannon with Bechtel. I had a question about new infrastructure development and playing on some of the themes that you all were talking about getting kind of people to the table and framing the issue properly. It seems like there's just this groundswell of almost any piece of infrastructure that's proposed or thought about, there's immediately opposition to it. And so for companies that are interested in building projects, is it worthwhile to even see, to do kind of the deeper dive into the stakeholders in each of the individual areas, and can you actually find solutions in specific regions, or is it just better, or are we in an environment where right from the beginning, no matter where you're going to build, just expect that it's going to be opposed in some way, shape, or form, and try to model that as best you can?
Well,
Okay.
look,
I was going to say, why don't we take one here, and
Okay.
then we'll try to combine them.
My name is Qi Han from Xinhua News Agency. Thank you for your wonderful comments. My question is about carbon tax, because we have just talked about the costs of fossil fuel and renewable energies, and one argument is that the reason that the price of fossil fuel is lower than renewable energy is that we didn't calculate its environment effect. So carbon tax is a good solution to make complement for that part. But unfortunately, according to my knowledge, there's no successful example of a country to implement effective carbon tax. So my question is that, what's your expectations or scenario of U.S. To implement carbon tax from federal government or to the state or local government? Because it seems that after the Paris Agreement, U.S. want to show its leadership in green development. Thank you.
Okay. So we have carbon tax and infrastructure. Do we have a third question that will make this discussion even bigger? Sarah, of course.
That's unfair.
Thank you, guys. Great discussion. I have a lot of questions, but maybe very specifically, since we're on infrastructure, so it'll fit. We went through a period where we were building out a huge amount of domestic midstream infrastructure, right? And it was a result of trying to move these new supplies of energy around the country. There's also aging infrastructure, right? And so we're going to have the director of PHMSA here next week. We're going to talk a lot about what the next administration should be thinking about in terms of modernizing the country's infrastructure, because we are blessed to have so much of it, but we just need to figure out how you're able to do that. So it's not only about the building of new infrastructure, but it's about thinking strategically about replacing old and aging infrastructure as well. How do you think a new administration or our policy conversation today is sort of geared to deal with that question?
Right.
Well, and just to frame that question, this is the whole notion of what's your timeline and what do you do with long-lived assets? Do you build something new that's not going to last for a long time? Do you fix something when you're making a transformation? And that's the kind of space we're in. So if you want to start.
Yeah, so let me see if I can bridge the two here. Okay, so first of all, the simple answer to your question is look, any piece of new infrastructure is always going to have to be attentive to community concerns, right? And that has always been the case in the United States. That will always be the case, and there's no silver bullet there, okay? In terms of the larger question about how much should we be investing in new infrastructure and how much political opposition do we get when we invest in new, my own view is that I think that, if people saw that we were making real progress in deploying the new low-carbon infrastructure that we're going to need in this country, right, it might be easier for people to accept that in the near term there has to be some new or even reinvestment in existing fossil fuel infrastructure during a period of transition, right? We don't see, as a practical matter, the same degree of development, or at least at the scale that we need it, in new clean energy infrastructure that we've been seeing in recent years in terms of fossil fuel development, right? And that has people suspicious, right? That they're being sold on the idea that this is consistent with some sort of transition to a clean energy future, but they're not really seeing the evidence of that and the public policy commitment to it. So that's one way to think about yours. Sarah, to your question, right? We know that aging infrastructure is a problem, right? Go back to Aliso Canyon, right? Major amount of methane emissions going into the atmosphere from a gas storage facility that was first put into place in 1970 on the basis of wells that were first drilled in the 1950s. Okay? There was an effort that the company made in recent years to increase the pressure that facility could be operated in because gas was so cheap and they just wanted to store every last ounce, and there's every evidence that they overpressurized the well. Okay? So they weren't maintaining or operating it properly. So this is a real big issue. If you talk about PHMSA, right, we don't actually know how much gas gathering infrastructure we have in the United States, much less how old it is, what condition it is. There's no national inventory of gas gathering infrastructure anywhere. So it's really difficult to know how to manage your existing infrastructure when you don't even know, as a practical matter, where it is or what condition it is. So there are some basic steps that we can and should be taking that could go a long way towards at least getting us started on the road to thinking about. And in the case of like Aliso Canyon, now that the facility has failed, it's raising a set of questions about exactly how much money should we reinvest in trying to put that facility back online? Or are we at a point where energy storage technologies, demand response, other innovations that have occurred since that facility was built really could shoulder most of the peak demand that facility was designed to meet in the first instance. And the question is as we continue to innovate on technology, you know, how much reinvestment do we need in the existing infrastructure versus beginning to transition to these new tools that we have as a result of both economic and technological innovation. So
this is partially the yeah, but moment. Going back to Karen's point, so Aliso Canyon serviced 22 million people outside of Los Angeles, right? So you'd have to replace, if you didn't do that, what gives them the energy that they need in a time frame that makes sense? So I get your point about repressurizing.
Right. But what that tells you is boy, have you become,
time for reevaluation.
In terms of energy security, right? Have you become, I mean, they're worried about blackouts this summer if they don't bring that facility online, right? So does that tell you that you become too dependent on a single fuel and a single facility? Is that smart from an energy security standpoint?
No, but it tells you in the interim it's indispensable, right? So
but it also tells you that you've got a problem that you now have to fix. In other words, going back to business as usual
absolutely
isn't the right approach.
Totally agree. Tisha.
Yeah, so 2 points about the climate of protest that we have. I spend most of my days working with companies who are dealing with controversial projects, and I think the nature I actually think it's significantly different than it was 10 years ago when I was permitting and helping to construct new projects. The expectations of communities have changed forever. And when I work with companies, so I'm talking to you about the importance of reframing, but when you're on the company trying to get things done side of things, expectations, you're going to need to be in a community months, not just for new infrastructure, but for fixing infrastructure. Yeah. It doesn't matter. If you're digging anywhere, anytime for anything, and it's associated with fossil fuel, you're going to have protesters, and you need to plan for it months in advance, during, and months after. And that's the nature of the world. Now, I think a huge critical mistake of the anti-fossil fuel movement is making all of these projects equally evil without any connection to what's actually happening. Because once you get into a community that's protesting, we don't want this fracking gas pipeline, and you do the bare minimum amount of trust building and education and camaraderie, that community then wants to know, well, what are the actual real issues we need to be concerned about? And then you can have, from a company perspective, an engaging conversation. But you also have lost the opportunity to have constructive, engaging relationships between companies and communities that can raise the bar in the ways that we could a few years ago that we can't right now. And the only thing I'll say about carbon tax, because I have no authority or empowerment to influence this in any way, so again, I'm unconstrained, is that the opportunity for a carbon tax can only be pursued in the context of it being a shared solution. Every time it's framed publicly right now, it's a punitive way to somehow transition away from fossil fuels, and that framing is not going to work in this world. But could a carbon tax work where it's a shared solution moving towards a more R&D focused world with with openness to the best solutions, I think it could, and I think it should.
I don't know.
On the infrastructure side, I just want to, this is equal opportunity opposition. It is not just for the fossil fuel, industry. There is such pushback against high voltage transmission lines intended to bring, wind from the Midwest to markets where they are needed. So it is discrimination and pushback against all forms of energy infrastructure. And it was quite striking. We did an inventory of proposed projects and how many renewable projects were being opposed from the very strident environmental advocates that are hoping for more renewable energy. And so we have to have a more rational discussion about, we're going to need to build some infrastructure here if we want to achieve a cleaner future. And it's going to include pipelines and it's going to include transmission lines. And the other question is if it's coming in my backyard, not literally, but in my county, but it's actually servicing a market 2 states away, what am I getting out of this? What's my equity? Where's my reward? Where's my... and so that discussion needs to take place about a vision going forward. But the other practical part of this is that these infrastructure projects, which bring employment, revenue, opportunity, tax revenue, et cetera, are a natural place for a coalition of business, labor, those that want a cleaner future, local communities that are in need of revenue. I mean, there's a natural coalition. That's places where those different entities have come together where it has worked. But it is reaching outside of the natural way we have done business, which is apply for the permit, get it, move on. It's bringing together the stakeholders, the local businesses, so they understand they can be good ambassadors for you, bringing in an EDF, or can see the long-term vision of how this achieves what we're all striving for. So it is a more complicated, but it has to be a more inclusive conversation. But I don't want it relegated to just pushing it back against the fossil fuel industry. We can't get wind farms built in the Northeast. We can't get solar farms in California. We can't get transmission lines in the in the Midwest. So it is problematic that we've got, we've moved from NIMBY to banana, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone. And we've got to be able to correct that. And we can nibble around the edges with permitting reform, et cetera, but we have to collectively want to get some of these things built to move either electrons or molecules to where they're needed. Now, the perverse part of this is that I think those that are firmly and stridently against fossil fuel development have identified this as a way to keep things in the ground. And that really is problematic, and it's going to require more community. If you can't move it, you're not going to get it out of the ground. So it is a much more convenient way to stop development of all forms of energy, unfortunately.
Let me just quickly, to answer to your question, if you look at California, AB 32 is a good example of a market-based approach to addressing climate change that is having tremendous both environmental impacts but also economic development impacts in the state of California. So that is a good example. In China, there are, 5 different provincial pilots that have been going on using cap and trade approaches to deal with pollution from power plants, so much so that the federal government now, national government, has adopted this into the next 5-year plan. So I think we do see examples of where these kinds of market mechanisms can be very effective as a matter of policy. But I think it's also fair to say, right, that there are other instruments that need to be deployed along with them in order to be able to get, the kind of transition that we're going to need in the time frame that we need it.
Excellent. So we haven't really addressed or solved the absolute issue versus the flexible issue. I do like the headroom frame, and we will certainly take this under advisement as we go forward. This will be many discussions as we move into the future. On the political side, it hasn't come up as an election year issue yet in the larger scheme of things, but I suspect no matter what happens, given the issues that have been put on the table, it will be in the inbox of the next administration no matter what happens. But if you'll join me, thank you so much for participating, and join me in thanking our panel.
Good job.
And you've got a couple of minutes before our next